The soft hum of the night often invites reflection, a gentle turning inward after the day's outward demands. Tonight, as the world quiets, we turn our attention to a peculiar aspect of the human mind, one that both bemuses and confounds. The phenomenon of individuals confidently believing themselves to be far more capable or knowledgeable than they actually are. Picture for a moment a person at a social gathering, holding court with absolute certainty on a complex geopolitical issue, despite having gleaned their entire understanding from a single, sensationalized headline. Or perhaps the amateur chef, convinced their experimental dish is a culinary masterpiece, oblivious to the grimaces around the table. We've all encountered such moments, perhaps even caught glimpses of this pattern within ourselves. There is a specific, often perplexing psychological mechanism at play here, and its echoes resonate deeply within the ancient chambers of spiritual wisdom. Modern psychology has given this phenomenon a name, the Dunning-Kruger effect. First articulated by social psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger in 1999, it describes a cognitive bias, wherein people with low ability at a task overestimate their own ability. Crucially, their incompetence not only leads them to make poor choices, but also deprives them of the metacognitive capacity to recognize their own errors. In essence, the skills required to perform competently are often the very same skills needed to accurately assess one's own competence. Consequently, the stupid people in the title are not inherently unintelligent, but rather those who lack specific knowledge or skill, and, due to that very lack, are unable to perceive their own deficits, leading them to think they're smart. This illusion of superiority is a fascinating and pervasive aspect of human cognition, touching every facet of our lives, from personal relationships to professional endeavors, and even our spiritual journeys. Yet this contemporary psychological insight is not merely a novel observation. It is a scientific articulation of a profound human condition that spiritual traditions across millennia have grappled with, the nature of ignorance, ego, and self-deception. Before any scientific study, ancient sages and mystics understood that a primary obstacle to true wisdom and inner peace was not external hardship, but an internal delusion, a lack of self-awareness that masquerades as knowledge. What Dunning and Kruger meticulously documented in laboratory settings, the Buddha illuminated through the concept of avidya, ignorance, Christian mystics explored as the pitfalls of pride, Sufi teachers warned against as the illusions of the nafs, and Vedantic philosophy identified as maya and ahamkara. This essay embarks on a journey to explore why stupid people think they're smart, not merely as a psychological quirk, but as a critical spiritual challenge. We will weave together the rigorous empirical findings of psychology with the profound experiential wisdom of diverse spiritual traditions, demonstrating how each lens offers unique, yet complementary insights into this universal human tendency. Our central thesis is that the Dunning-Kruger effect, while framed by cognitive science, is a contemporary manifestation of fundamental spiritual ignorance and ego-driven delusion, and that genuine self-awareness, psychological and spiritual, is the only antidote to its pervasive influence. To navigate this intricate landscape, we will first establish a comprehensive psychological and spiritual framework. From the psychological perspective, we will delve into the origins and components of the Dunning-Kruger effect, examining its relationship to metacognition, various cognitive biases such as confirmation bias and overconfidence, and the neurological underpinnings of self-assessment. We will explore how a lack of true competence can paradoxically inflate self-perception, making individuals blind to their own limitations. Simultaneously, we will integrate this with spiritual perspectives. Buddhist teachings on avidya, ignorance, and anatta, no self, which highlight how clinging to a false sense of self, ego, perpetuates delusion. Christian contemplative wisdom on the dangers of pride, superbia, and the necessity of humility, humilitas for spiritual growth. Islamic Sufi insights into the deceptive nature of the nafs, ego self, and the pursuit of ma'rifa, gnosis, beyond mere intellectual knowledge. Hindu Vedantic philosophy on maya, illusion, and ahamkara, ego sense, obscuring the true Atman, and existential philosophy's exploration of bad faith and the imperative of authenticity. We will also touch upon Taoist principles of knowing that you don't know and the cultivation of a beginner's mind. Following this foundational framework, we will examine the modern manifestations of this phenomenon, considering how digital echo chambers, social media, and contemporary cultural trends amplify the Dunning-Kruger effect, fostering environments where ill-informed confidence can thrive. We will explore how modern spiritual movements sometimes fall prey to similar dynamics, leading to spiritual bypassing or the glorification of superficial understanding. To ground our theoretical discussions, we will then turn to illustrative examples and brief case studies. These will include historical spiritual figures who wrestled with pride and achieved humility, anonymized psychological research participants demonstrating the Dunning-Kruger effect, modern composite examples of online experts, and literary or mythological archetypes that embody the perils of overconfidence born of ignorance. These brief vignettes will serve not as extended narratives, but as concise illuminations of the concepts already explained. Finally, we will explore practical integration, offering pathways toward cultivating genuine self-awareness and wisdom. This section will present both psychological interventions, such as metacognitive training seeking objective feedback and Socratic questioning, and spiritual practices drawn from various traditions, including mindfulness, self-inquiry, humility practices, and contemplative discernment. Our aim is to offer actionable strategies for navigating the treacherous terrain of self-deception and fostering a more authentic, humble, and ultimately wiser way of being in the world. By integrating the analytical rigor of psychology with the profound insights of spiritual wisdom, this essay seeks to offer a holistic understanding of why people, lacking competence, often believe themselves to be smart. It is a journey not just into the mechanics of the mind, but into the depths of the human spirit, inviting us to reflect on our own blind spots and to cultivate the profound humility that is the true hallmark of wisdom. As we delve into this topic, may we approach it with an open mind and a discerning heart, recognizing that the path to knowledge often begins with the courageous admission of our own ignorance. Having established the broad contours of our inquiry, the Dunning-Kruger effect as a modern psychological articulation of ancient spiritual truths concerning ignorance and ego, we now turn our focus to the foundational psychological bedrock upon which this phenomenon rests. Before we can integrate the profound insights of spiritual traditions, it is imperative that we first rigorously define and dissect the cognitive mechanisms at play. This chapter, therefore, serves as our foray into the intricate architecture of the human mind, exploring the precise psychological origins of why, in so many instances, the unskilled remain blissfully unaware of their ineptitude. At its core, the Dunning-Kruger effect describes a cognitive bias, wherein individuals with low ability at a particular task or in a specific domain significantly overestimate their competence. It is not merely a misjudgment, it is a profound metacognitive deficit. Those afflicted by this bias endure what psychologists Justin Kruger and David Dunning famously termed a dual burden. They are not only incompetent, but they also lack the metacognitive capacity, the very skill set required to accurately assess their own performance, to recognize their incompetence. This absence of self-assessment capability means they are unable to discern their errors, unable to distinguish between genuine expertise and mere pretension, and consequently unable to learn from their mistakes or appreciate the superior skills of others. The linchpin of this entire phenomenon is unequivocally metacognition. Derived from the Greek meta, beyond, and Latin cognitio, knowing, metacognition is often simply defined as thinking about thinking. It encompasses an individual's awareness of their own thought processes, their ability to monitor and regulate their learning, and their capacity to evaluate their understanding and performance. We can broadly delineate metacognition into two principal components: metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation. Metacognitive knowledge refers to what we know about our own cognitive abilities, our strengths and our weaknesses, as well as knowledge about tasks and strategies. For instance, a student with strong metacognitive knowledge understands that rote memorization is insufficient for complex problem solving. Metacognitive regulation, on the other hand, involves the active monitoring and control of one's learning processes. This includes planning an approach to a task, monitoring one's comprehension during learning, and evaluating the outcome of a strategy. A metacognitively adept individual, when faced with a challenging problem, might pause, consider various approaches, select one, monitor its effectiveness, and, if necessary, pivot to an alternative strategy. It is precisely the deficiency in these metacognitive skills that underpins the Dunning-Kruger effect. Individuals operating at the lowest tiers of competence often lack the foundational knowledge and the discriminative judgment required to even recognize what good performance looks like in their domain. Without a robust internal standard, they cannot compare their own subpar output against an objective benchmark. They are akin to a tone-deaf musician who believes their off-key singing is perfectly harmonious because they cannot perceive pitch accurately. Their inability to recognize their own errors precludes them from understanding why they are failing, and crucially prevents them from learning how to improve. This creates a self-reinforcing loop of confident ignorance, where the very skills needed to escape incompetence are the same skills that are absent. The empirical evidence for this fascinating and often perplexing bias was meticulously documented by Dunning-Kruger and David Dunning in their seminal 1999 paper, Unskilled and Unaware of It: How Difficulties in Recognizing One's Own Incompetence Lead to Inflated Self-Assessments, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Their series of experiments involved assessing participants' abilities in various domains, including humor, logical reasoning, and grammar. Following these assessments, participants were asked to estimate their own performance relative to others. The results were striking and consistent. Participants who performed in the bottom quartile of actual ability consistently and significantly overestimated their performance, often placing themselves well above the average. Conversely, those in the top quartile, while generally accurate in their self-assessments, often underestimated their relative skill, a phenomenon sometimes colloquially referred to as imposter syndrome. This latter finding underscores a different aspect of metacognition. Highly competent individuals, possessing a clearer understanding of the complexity of a domain, are more aware of the vastness of what they don't know, leading to a more tempered, sometimes even overly modest, self-appraisal. Beyond this core metacognitive deficit, the Dunning-Kruger effect is further buttressed and amplified by a constellation of other well-documented cognitive biases that collectively conspire to maintain an individual's inflated self-perception. One of the most pervasive is confirmation bias. The human tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. For someone with low competence but high self-regard, confirmation bias means they will preferentially attend to any feedback, however slight or tangential, that validates their inflated self-assessment, while dismissing or rationalizing away any contradictory evidence. A poorly performing amateur artist, for example, might cling to a single polite compliment from a friend while ignoring the consistent lack of sales or critical appraisal, interpreting the former as proof of their inherent talent and the latter as a failure of others to appreciate true genius. Closely related is the self-serving bias, a cognitive error wherein individuals attribute positive outcomes to their own character or efforts, internal factors, and negative outcomes to external factors beyond their control. When a project succeeds, it is due to their brilliance. When it fails, it is due to insufficient resources, uncooperative colleagues, or bad luck. This bias acts as a robust psychological defense mechanism, shielding the ego from the painful sting of inadequacy and preventing any genuine introspection into one's own role in failures. It effectively blocks the feedback loop that is essential for learning and improvement, thereby solidifying the Dunning-Kruger illusion. Another significant contributor is illusory superiority, often referred to as the above-average effect. This is the general tendency for people to overestimate their own qualities and abilities relative to others. Most people, when asked, believe they are better than average drivers, more ethical, or more intelligent. While Dunning-Kruger specifically addresses overestimation in areas of low competence, illusory superiority provides a broader psychological context. The human mind seems predisposed to view itself favorably. This inherent optimism bias, when coupled with a lack of specific skill and metacognitive insight, becomes a potent ingredient for the Dunning-Kruger phenomenon. Furthermore, anchoring bias can play a subtle but significant role. When individuals form an initial, often optimistic self-assessment of their abilities, this initial anchor can disproportionately influence subsequent judgments, even in the face of contradictory evidence. It becomes difficult to shift away from this initial, flattering self-perception, reinforcing the confidence born of ignorance. Similarly, the fundamental attribution error. The tendency to overemphasize dispositional or personality-based explanations for others' behavior, while underemphasizing situational explanations for one's own, can lead individuals to view others' failures as a sign of their inherent incompetence, while viewing their own as products of unfortunate circumstances. This creates a judgmental framework that further entrenches their own perceived superiority. These cognitive biases are not mere intellectual curiosities, they are deeply ingrained psychological shortcuts that, in many contexts, serve evolutionary purposes, helping us make quick decisions or maintain a positive self-image for mental well-being. However, in the context of skill acquisition and accurate self-assessment, they become formidable obstacles. They are the psychological scaffolding that supports the edifice of confident incompetence, making it incredibly resistant to challenge or correction. The Dunning-Kruger effect, then, is not merely a random error in judgment, but a systematic failure of metacognition, compounded and protected by a suite of ego-preserving cognitive biases. Understanding these psychological underpinnings is paramount, because it reveals that the issue is rarely one of malicious intent or deliberate deception. Instead, it is often a genuine, albeit misguided belief in one's own capabilities, born from a profound lack of the very tools needed to assess those capabilities accurately. The individual exhibiting the Dunning-Kruger effect is not necessarily unintelligent in a general sense. Rather, they lack specific knowledge or skill in a given domain, and critically lack the ability to recognize that deficiency. This distinction is vital as we prepare to bridge the gap between these psychological insights and the ancient spiritual wisdom traditions. For if modern psychology elucidates the how of self-deception, ancient spiritual teachings often illuminate the deeper why. The role of ego, pride, and fundamental ignorance in obscuring truth, both about the self and the world. The psychological mechanisms we have explored here provide the concrete, observable manifestations of phenomena that spiritual masters have pondered for millennia, offering us a common ground upon which to build a holistic understanding of the human condition. Having meticulously charted the psychological terrain of the Dunning-Kruger effect in our preceding chapter, observing its intricate mechanisms of metacognitive deficit and reinforcing cognitive biases, we now stand at a crucial juncture. The how of confident incompetence, illuminated by modern psychological inquiry, demands a deeper exploration into its why, a profound inquiry into the root causes of human self-deception that resonates across millennia. It is here that we turn our gaze from the empirical laboratories of the present to the timeless wisdom traditions of the past, seeking resonance between contemporary findings and the enduring insights of ancient sages, mystics, and spiritual teachers. For centuries, before the advent of cognitive science, these profound traditions grappled with the very essence of human ignorance and the ego's tenacious grip on our perception of reality. They understood, often through rigorous introspection and observation of the human condition, that a fundamental misunderstanding of self and world was not merely a lack of information, but a pervasive state of being that obscured truth and perpetuated suffering. The Dunning-Kruger effect, in this grander narrative, emerges not as an isolated modern anomaly, but as a specific, measurable manifestation of these ancient, deeply ingrained human tendencies. A contemporary articulation of what spiritual masters have long identified as obstacles to genuine enlightenment and self-awareness. Let us begin our cross-cultural journey with the profound insights of Buddhism, where the concept of avidya, or fundamental ignorance, stands as a cornerstone of its philosophical framework. Avidya is not simply a lack of knowledge in the conventional sense. It is a primal misapprehension of the true nature of reality, an inability to see things as they truly are. It is the ignorance of the impermanent, interdependent, and non-self nature of existence, leading to the mistaken belief in a permanent, independent, and separate self and ego. This fundamental ignorance, according to Buddhist teachings, is the root cause of all suffering, dukkha, and the perpetuator of the cycle of rebirth, samsara. The parallels to the Dunning-Kruger effect are striking. Just as individuals afflicted by DKE are unaware of their own incompetence, unable to recognize their errors due to a deficit in metacognitive capacity, so too does avidya manifest as a profound unawareness of one's own ignorance. It prevents the individual from perceiving the very condition of their delusion. The confident pronouncements of the DKE-affected individual, rooted in an inability to discern their own lack of skill, mirror the deluded certainty born of avidya, a certainty that clings to illusions as reality. This is not merely an intellectual oversight, but a deeply ingrained habit of mind, a blindness to one's own blind spots. The Buddhist path, with its emphasis on mindfulness, meditation, and wisdom, prajna, offers a systematic methodology for gradually dismantling avidya, cultivating clear seeing, and recognizing the illusory nature of the self that avidya constructs and defends. It is a journey from confident ignorance to enlightened awareness, a direct confrontation with the very mechanisms of self-deception that DKE elucidates. Moving westward, we encounter similar wisdom within the Abrahamic traditions, particularly in Christianity, where the concept of pride holds a paramount position. Often considered the root of all sin or the original sin, pride is understood not merely as vanity, but as an excessive love of one's own excellence, an overestimation of one's own worth and abilities, leading to a refusal to acknowledge dependence on a higher power or to accept one's own limitations. It is a spiritual hubris that blinds the individual to truth and humility. The resonance with DKE is palpable. The illusory superiority and self-serving bias observed in DKE-affected individuals are psychological manifestations of what Christian theology identifies as pride. The confident incompetence, the unshakable conviction in one's own unfounded expertise, the resistance to correction or alternative viewpoints, these are all hallmarks of a proud spirit. Pride prevents genuine self-assessment, fostering an inflated sense of self that cannot tolerate the discomfort of recognizing error or inadequacy. It creates a closed system of self-affirmation, making the individual impervious to external feedback that might challenge their carefully constructed self-image. Conversely, humility, a cardinal virtue in Christianity, is presented as the antidote to pride. Humility involves a realistic assessment of one's strengths and weaknesses, an openness to learning, and a willingness to acknowledge one's limitations. It is the very quality that DKE-affected individuals lack, and its cultivation is essential for breaking free from the cycle of confident ignorance. The spiritual journey in this context is one of humbling the ego, dissolving the proud self, and opening to truth through self-knowledge and grace. In the mystical tradition of Sufism, the esoteric branch of Islam, we find the concept of nafs, often translated as the ego, self, or soul, particularly in its lower, unpurified state. The nafs is seen as the seat of desires, passions, and self-aggrandizement, prone to delusion, arrogance, and an insatiable craving for recognition and power. The Sufi path, known as tariqa, is fundamentally a journey of purifying the nafs, bringing it under control and ultimately transforming it into a state of peace and submission to divine will. The nafs in its unrefined state perfectly encapsulates the ego-driven aspects of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Its relentless pursuit of self-validation, its resistance to criticism, and its tendency towards self-deception are directly mirrored in the cognitive biases that underpin DKE. The nafs creates a subjective reality where its own limited perceptions and desires are elevated to absolute truth, making it exceedingly difficult for the individual to recognize their own ignorance or errors. The confident incompetence observed in DKE is, from a Sufi perspective, a direct symptom of an unbridled nafs that demands to be seen as superior, regardless of actual ability. The Sufi masters understood that true knowledge and wisdom could only emerge once the veils of the nafs were lifted, a process requiring rigorous self-discipline, introspection, and spiritual guidance. The struggle against the nafs is a struggle against one's own inner delusions and false sense of self, a battle for authentic self-awareness against the powerful currents of ego-driven illusion. Finally, let us explore the profound insights of Vedanta, a major school of Hindu philosophy, particularly its concepts of Maya and Ahamkara. Maya refers to the illusory power that veils the ultimate reality, Brahman, and projects the phenomenal world of multiplicity and duality. It is a cosmic illusion that makes the relative appear absolute, the temporary seem permanent, and the unreal appear real. Ahamkara, on the other hand, is the ego sense, the individual's false identification with the mind, body, and senses, leading to the mistaken belief in a separate, limited I. Here too the connections to the Dunning-Kruger effect are strikingly clear. Maya can be understood as the overarching framework of delusion that allows confident ignorance to flourish. It is the mental environment where limited knowledge is mistaken for comprehensive understanding, where subjective opinions are elevated to objective truths. The DKE-affected individual, operating within this veil of Maya, cannot perceive the vastness of their own ignorance because their perception of reality itself is distorted. Their limited understanding appears complete and self-sufficient. Ahamkara, the ego sense, then provides the confident assertion of this limited, illusory understanding. It is the I that believes it knows, the I that overestimates its abilities, and the I that resists any challenge to its perceived competence. The inability to think about thinking, metacognition, in DKE finds its spiritual counterpart in the Ahamkara's inability to transcend its own limited perspective and recognize its true boundless nature. The Vedantic path, particularly through Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, aims to pierce through the veils of Maya and dismantle Ahamkara through rigorous self-inquiry, discrimination and meditation, leading to the realization of the true self beyond the confines of the deluded ego. What emerges from this cross-cultural survey is a profound and consistent narrative. The phenomenon of confident ignorance, now meticulously documented as the Dunning-Kruger effect, is not a novel psychological glitch, but a deeply rooted aspect of the human condition, understood and addressed by spiritual traditions for millennia. Whether termed avidya, pride, nafs, or Maya and Ahamkara, these concepts all point to a fundamental self-deception, an ego-driven delusion that prevents individuals from accurately perceiving their own limitations and the true nature of reality. The common threads are undeniable: the pervasive nature of self-deception, the central role of ego and ignorance as impediments to truth, and the shared emphasis on humility, introspection, and authentic self-awareness as the primary antidotes. These spiritual traditions offer not just a diagnosis of the human predicament, but also profound, time-tested methodologies for transcending these delusions. They articulate a deeper why for the DKE, suggesting that confident incompetence is not merely a cognitive flaw, but a symptom of a more fundamental spiritual blindness, a profound misunderstanding of who we are and our place in the cosmos. By integrating the psychological how with the spiritual why, we gain a far more comprehensive and actionable understanding of the Dunning-Kruger effect. It transforms our perception of the issue from a mere intellectual failing into a profound challenge to our very sense of self and our journey towards wisdom. This dual lens allows us to appreciate that, while modern psychology provides the precise vocabulary and empirical evidence, ancient wisdom offers the expansive context and the enduring spiritual practices necessary for cultivating the humility and self-awareness required to overcome such deeply ingrained patterns of confident ignorance. Having laid this foundational understanding, we are now prepared to examine how these ancient patterns manifest in the intricate and often bewildering complexities of our modern world, and what practical pathways might lead us toward genuine clarity and wisdom. The quiet hum of the night, a subtle backdrop to our intellectual journey, now gives way to the more cacophonous symphony of the modern world. Having meticulously dissected the psychological architecture of the Dunning-Kruger effect and unveiled its profound resonance with ancient spiritual understandings of ignorance and ego, we now turn our gaze to the contemporary landscape. The mechanisms and spiritual undercurrents we have explored are not static relics of the past. Rather, they are dynamic forces perpetually manifesting in new guises, amplified and distorted by the very technologies we create. Our task in this chapter is to examine how these timeless patterns of self-deception and confident ignorance permeate and shape modern society, particularly in the digital age. We posit that the modern era, with its unprecedented access to information and platforms for self-expression, has inadvertently created an environment uniquely fertile for the propagation and amplification of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The digital realm, ostensibly a democratizer of knowledge, has paradoxically become a crucible for superficial understanding and unchecked overconfidence. Consider first the pervasive phenomenon of digital echo chambers and filter bubbles. Algorithms designed to personalize our online experience and our own inherent biases lead us into self-reinforcing informational environments. Within these cocoons, individuals are primarily exposed to content and opinions that affirm their existing beliefs, seldom encountering dissenting viewpoints or nuanced perspectives that might challenge their perceived expertise. This creates a powerful feedback loop where limited knowledge is constantly validated, preventing the crucial metacognitive process of questioning one's own understanding. The individual, already predisposed to overestimate their abilities, as Chapter 2 elucidated, finds this illusory superiority buttressed by a seemingly endless stream of corroborating data. This digital affirmation becomes a modern manifestation of the ego's insatiable hunger for validation, a technological extension of the nafs or ahamkara, seeking to solidify its false sense of self through external agreement rather than internal coherence. Furthermore, the sheer volume and accessibility of information online often foster a dangerous illusion of knowledge. A quick search engine query can provide a summary of complex topics, from quantum physics to geopolitical history, in mere seconds. While undeniably useful, this ease of access can be mistaken for genuine comprehension. We witness individuals, after a cursory reading of a few articles or a single infographic, confidently asserting expertise on subjects that require years of dedicated study and practical experience. This superficial engagement with information bypasses the arduous process of critical analysis, synthesis, and deep reflection necessary for true understanding. It is a modern form of avidya, where the shadow of information is mistaken for the substance of wisdom, and the perceived completeness of a search result supplants the recognition of vast, unexplored intellectual territories. The cognitive burden of recognizing one's own ignorance is thus lifted, replaced by the effortless confidence born of easily retrievable, yet shallow, data. The very architecture of social media platforms further exacerbates this tendency. By providing a global stage for every individual, regardless of their qualifications, to broadcast their opinions, these platforms inadvertently become crucibles for the Dunning-Kruger effect. The loudest, most confidently asserted opinions often gain the most traction, irrespective of their factual basis or intellectual rigor. This dynamic incentivizes performative certainty over genuine insight. We observe countless instances where individuals, lacking any formal training or deep understanding, engage in heated debates with established experts, often dismissing years of research with a few glib pronouncements. The perceived anonymity and disinhibition afforded by their online interactions further embolden this behavior, lowering the social cost of expressing ill-informed confidence. This is a public display of the ego's pride, where the need to be perceived as knowledgeable overrides the actual possession of knowledge, leading to a relentless assertion of self, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Consider specific modern contexts where these dynamics are vividly played out. The online comments section stands as an archetypal arena for the Dunning-Kruger effect. Here, discussions ranging from vaccine efficacy to economic policy, from climate science to literary criticism, are frequently dominated by individuals who, despite possessing minimal understanding of the underlying complexities, confidently articulate their views with an unshakable conviction. Their inability to recognize their own logical fallacies or factual inaccuracies is a direct manifestation of the metacognitive deficit we explored in Chapter 2. Beyond the digital sphere, the phenomenon of armchair experts has proliferated. These are individuals who, having consumed a documentary, a podcast series, or a few popular science articles, suddenly deem themselves qualified to critique the methodologies of professional scientists, the strategies of seasoned politicians, or the diagnoses of experienced medical practitioners. This is not merely a benign expression of interest. It is often accompanied by a profound overestimation of their own grasp of the subject matter, leading to dismissive attitudes towards genuine expertise. The dual burden of incompetence and the inability to recognize that incompetence is starkly visible here, as the initial learning curve, often steep and challenging, is prematurely abandoned for the comforting plateau of perceived mastery. In the realm of polarized discourse, particularly in politics and social issues, the Dunning-Kruger effect contributes significantly to the erosion of constructive dialogue. When individuals on all sides of a debate are convinced of their own infallible understanding, often based on incomplete or biased information, genuine engagement becomes impossible. Those with the most limited understanding are frequently the most dogmatic, least open to nuance, and most resistant to alternative viewpoints. Any challenge to their position is interpreted not as an opportunity for learning, but as a personal attack, an assault on their pride and their carefully constructed sense of intellectual superiority. This dynamic fuels the fragmentation of society, making collective problem-solving an increasingly arduous endeavor. Even in more benign domains, such as hobbies or nascent professional skills, we can observe this pattern. A novice investor might experience initial success due to market fluctuations and then, attributing it solely to their own sagacity, become overly confident, leading to reckless decisions. A new gamer, after a few lucky wins, might overestimate their skill only to be humbled by more experienced players. In these instances, the initial learning curve can be deceptive, offering just enough positive reinforcement to trigger the overconfidence that precedes a more comprehensive understanding of the domain's true depth and complexity. The pervasive nature of these modern manifestations underscores a critical point. Technology does not create the Dunning-Kruger effect, but it provides unprecedented avenues for its expression and amplification. The underlying psychological biases, confirmation bias, self-serving bias, illusory superiority, remain the fundamental drivers and the spiritual roots of ignorance, avidya, ego, nafs, ahamkara, and pride continue to animate these tendencies. What has changed is the scale and speed with which these patterns can spread and solidify within individuals and across communities. The societal implications are profound. The erosion of trust in genuine expertise, the proliferation of misinformation, and the increasing difficulty in discerning credible information from confident assertion pose significant challenges to democratic processes, public health initiatives, and collective intellectual progress. When the loudest and most confident voices are often the least informed, the very fabric of an informed society begins to fray. Recognizing these modern manifestations is, therefore, more than an academic exercise. It is a critical step towards understanding the contemporary human condition. It compels us to confront how deeply ingrained these patterns of self-deception are, and how readily they are exploited by the very structures of our digital age. The challenge now is not merely to identify the problem, but to cultivate the antidotes, the humility, the rigorous self-awareness, and the commitment to genuine critical thinking, in an environment that often rewards superficial confidence over profound insight. It is to these practical pathways toward genuine clarity and wisdom that we shall turn our attention next, seeking to illuminate a path forward from the shadows of confident ignorance. The digital age, with its siren song of instant information and performative certainty, has undoubtedly amplified the Dunning-Kruger effect, creating a landscape where superficial confidence often eclipses genuine understanding. We have explored how the modern world, often unwittingly, conspires to reinforce our inherent tendencies towards self-deception, solidifying echo chambers and rewarding the loudest, most simplistic declarations. Yet to merely diagnose the malady without proposing a remedy would be an incomplete and ultimately disempowering endeavour. The fundamental question that now confronts us is not simply why stupid people think they're smart, but rather how can we cultivate the wisdom to recognise our own intellectual limitations and foster a more accurate, humble self-assessment in ourselves and others? How do we counteract the cognitive biases that blind us, especially in an environment seemingly designed to exacerbate them? The antidotes to the Dunning-Kruger effect, and indeed to the broader human condition of self-deception, are neither novel nor complex in their essence, though their consistent application demands profound discipline and courage. They are rooted in principles articulated by sages across millennia, now validated and refined by the modern psychological inquiry: humility, rigorous self-awareness, and the deliberate cultivation of metacognitive skills. These are not passive states but active ongoing practices, a commitment to a life of perpetual inquiry and intellectual honesty. At the heart of the solution lies humility, not as a performative modesty, but as a genuine recognition of the vastness of knowledge and the inherent limitations of any single intellect. The ancient Greek aphorism, "I know that I know nothing," attributed to Socrates, is perhaps the earliest and most potent articulation of this principle. It is the very inverse of the Dunning-Kruger phenomenon, where the truly wise understand the scope of their ignorance, while the less competent remain blissfully unaware of theirs. This humility is the intellectual gateway to genuine learning, for one cannot absorb new knowledge if one believes one already possesses all that is necessary. It is the willingness to be wrong, to be corrected, and to admit I don't know that marks the true beginning of wisdom. Building upon this foundation, self-awareness emerges as the critical metacognitive capacity required to bridge the gap between perceived and actual competence. This is not merely an awareness of one's strengths, but more crucially, an honest appraisal of one's weaknesses, biases, and knowledge gaps. It is the ability to step back and observe one's own cognitive processes, to scrutinize the origins of one's beliefs, and to question the certainty with which they are held. For those afflicted by the Dunning-Kruger effect, this capacity is precisely what is lacking. They possess a metacognitive deficit that prevents them from recognizing their own errors. Therefore, cultivating self-awareness becomes a deliberate practice of developing the missing internal feedback loop. How then do we cultivate this elusive metacognitive insight? The path is multifaceted, encompassing both intellectual rigor and personal introspection. Firstly, we must engage in active self-reflection. This involves a conscious and consistent effort to examine our thoughts, assumptions, and conclusions. Practices such as journaling, where one articulates the reasoning behind their beliefs and explores alternative perspectives, can be immensely valuable. We must learn to ask ourselves probing questions. What evidence supports this belief? From whom did I acquire this information, and what might be their biases? Have I considered alternative explanations? What are the potential flaws in my own reasoning? This internal dialogue, when conducted with genuine curiosity rather than defensive self-justification, begins to illuminate the blind spots that ego and ignorance so readily create. Secondly, and perhaps most challenging, is the deliberate act of seeking disconfirming evidence. Human beings are naturally prone to confirmation bias, gravitating towards information that validates their existing beliefs. To counteract this, we must actively and intentionally expose ourselves to viewpoints that challenge our deeply held convictions. This is not about engaging in adversarial debate, but about genuinely attempting to understand the logic and evidence behind opposing perspectives. It requires intellectual courage to confront ideas that may dismantle our comfortable worldviews, and intellectual empathy to appreciate the sincerity of others' positions. When we can articulate an opposing argument as well as its proponents, only then can we truly claim to understand the issue, and only then can our own conclusions be considered robust. Thirdly, the establishment of robust or feedback loops is indispensable. In an era where many prefer the comfort of echo chambers, actively soliciting constructive criticism from trusted, knowledgeable sources becomes a vital, albeit often uncomfortable, practice. True growth rarely occurs in a vacuum. It requires external input that can highlight our errors and guide our improvement. This means seeking out mentors, engaging in peer review, or simply asking for honest assessments from those whose judgment we respect. The initial sting of criticism often gives way to the profound satisfaction of genuine learning and refinement. For the Dunning-Kruger individual who struggles to self-correct, such external feedback is critical, provided it is delivered and received within a framework of trust and a shared commitment to truth. Furthermore, the very process of deliberate practice and the pursuit of mastery in any given domain naturally serves as an antidote. As individuals progress from novice to expert, they invariably encounter the vast complexity of their chosen field. The initial confidence of the novice, based on a superficial understanding, gives way to a period of conscious incompetence, where the learner recognizes the depth of their ignorance. It is this phase of profound humility and diligent effort that leads to genuine competence and eventually to expert intuition. The Dunning-Kruger effect predicts that the lowest performers are least aware of their deficits, while moderately competent individuals often underestimate their abilities. It is only at the expert level that individuals, having traversed the landscape of their domain, gain a more accurate, albeit often humble, assessment of their true capabilities and the limitations of even their own extensive knowledge. The more one genuinely learns, the more one realizes how much more there is to know, thereby naturally reducing the overconfidence born of ignorance. In a broader societal context, the cultivation of critical thinking and media literacy must be prioritized. Education systems, rather than solely focusing on the transmission of facts, must emphasize the process of inquiry. Inquiry, logical reasoning, and the ability to discern credible information from misinformation We must teach individuals how to evaluate sources, identify logical fallacies, and understand the mechanisms of propaganda and bias. In the digital age, where information is abundant but discernment is scarce, these skills are no longer merely academic virtues, but essential tools for navigating the complexities of modern life and resisting the seductive pull of oversimplified narratives. Navigating the modern digital landscape specifically demands a conscious effort towards mindful information consumption. We must actively curate our digital environments, diversifying our information diets beyond the algorithms that seek to reinforce our existing preferences. This means consciously seeking out news from varied perspectives, engaging with content that requires deeper thought rather than instant gratification, and recognizing the inherent biases of social media platforms designed to prioritize engagement over accuracy. Resisting the urge for simplistic answers or performative certainty online, and instead embracing nuance and complexity, is a direct counter to the digital amplification of Dunning-Kruger. Finally, the wisdom traditions, which first identified the ego and ignorance as primary obstacles, offer timeless spiritual practices for cultivating self-awareness. Mindfulness and meditation, for example, train the mind to observe its own workings, to identify the arising of egoic thoughts, and to reduce attachment to fixed beliefs. By cultivating a detached awareness of our internal landscape, we can begin to see the patterns of self-deception unfold in real time. These practices do not promise instant enlightenment, but offer a consistent pathway to greater inner clarity, allowing us to recognize when our ego is driving our convictions rather than genuine understanding. The journey towards genuine self-awareness and wisdom is a lifelong endeavor, fraught with challenges and requiring continuous effort. The Dunning-Kruger effect reminds us that the greatest obstacle often lies within ourselves, our own blind spots, our own ego, our own resistance to acknowledging what we do not know. Yet by embracing humility, actively practicing metacognition, seeking honest feedback, pursuing mastery, and mindfully navigating the complexities of the modern world, we can begin to dismantle the architecture of self-deception. This is not merely an individual pursuit of intellectual integrity, it is a collective imperative. For a society to thrive, to make informed decisions, and to foster genuine progress, its members must possess the capacity to accurately assess their own knowledge and limitations. The work of cultivating self-awareness is therefore not just about becoming smarter in the conventional sense, but about becoming more human, more discerning, and ultimately more wise. It is the ongoing, challenging work of seeing ourselves and the world more clearly. Having meticulously explored the individual mechanisms and spiritual parallels of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and having outlined practical antidotes for its mitigation in Chapter 5, we now turn our gaze from the personal to the public. If the cultivation of humility, self-awareness, and metacognitive rigor offers a potent defense against the insidious creep of intellectual overconfidence, why do we observe its widespread and often devastating manifestations in our collective spheres? Why, despite the availability of intellectual and spiritual tools, does the collective seem so susceptible to the allure of certainty over competence, particularly in an era that purports to value knowledge above all else? The answer, we contend, lies not merely in the individual's cognitive blind spots, but in the systemic structures and cultural currents that amplify, reward, and even necessitate such self-deception within the public square. The Dunning-Kruger effect, when left unchecked, metastasizes from a personal foible into a collective delusion, eroding the very foundations of informed discourse, effective governance, and societal progress. Consider the landscape of public discourse in the contemporary world. The digital revolution, as we touched upon in Chapter 4, has democratized information, yet paradoxically, it has simultaneously democratized misinformation and the authority to disseminate it. In this environment, the Dunning-Kruger effect finds fertile ground, empowering individuals with superficial understanding to assert their views with an unshakable conviction that often eclipses the reasoned arguments of genuine experts. We witness this phenomenon daily across social media platforms, in comment sections, and even within mainstream media where the loudest, most confident voice frequently garners more attention than the most knowledgeable. The performative certainty of the ill-informed, amplified by algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy, creates a cacophony where genuine expertise struggles to be heard, let alone respected. This collective amplification of Dunning-Kruger is particularly perilous in areas demanding specialized knowledge and nuanced understanding. Public health, climate science, economic policy, and international relations. When complex scientific consensus is dismissed by individuals armed with a few hours of internet research, or when intricate geopolitical realities are reduced to simplistic slogans by self-proclaimed strategists, the consequences are tangible and severe. Policy decisions become vulnerable to populist sentiment rather than evidence-based reasoning. Public trust in institutions, expertise, and objective truth erodes, paving the way for further polarization and societal fragmentation. The collective inability to distinguish between genuine competence and confidently asserted ignorance becomes a critical vulnerability, threatening the very fabric of a well-functioning democracy. Furthermore, we must acknowledge the inherent human tendency towards tribalism, which can exacerbate the Dunning-Kruger effect on a societal scale. When individuals identify strongly with a particular group, ideology, or political affiliation, their self-deception can become intertwined with group identity. Disconfirming evidence is not merely a challenge to an individual's flawed understanding. It becomes an attack on the group itself. This phenomenon fosters echo chambers where shared ignorance is reinforced, and dissenting voices are not just ignored, but actively demonized. Within these intellectual silos, the Dunning-Kruger effect becomes a collective shield, protecting the group's shared biases and preventing any genuine introspection or re-evaluation of its foundational tenets. The comfort of belonging, of shared certainty, often outweighs the discomfort of confronting uncomfortable truths. The implications for leadership are equally profound. In a world increasingly dominated by the optics of confidence, the Dunning-Kruger effect can lead to the elevation of individuals who possess an inflated sense of their own capabilities but lack the requisite wisdom, experience, or critical thinking skills. Prone to overestimating their own judgment and underestimating the complexity of challenges can steer organizations and nations towards avoidable pitfalls. Their inability to recognize their own limitations often translates into an unwillingness to seek or heed expert advice, fostering environments where dissent is suppressed and critical feedback is unwelcome. The humility that Chapter 5 identified as a cornerstone of genuine wisdom is often perceived as a weakness in the competitive arenas of politics and business, leading to a perverse incentive structure that rewards overconfidence, even when it is unfounded. What then are the systemic antidotes to this collective delusion? How do we inoculate the public square against the pervasive influence of Dunning-Kruger? Our journey suggests several critical pathways. Firstly, a fundamental reimagining of education is imperative. Beyond imparting factual knowledge, educational systems must prioritize the cultivation of metacognitive skills, critical thinking, and intellectual humility from an early age. We must teach not just what to think, but how to think, how to evaluate sources, how to recognize one's own cognitive biases, and how to embrace the discomfort of not knowing. Fostering a genuine curiosity that values inquiry over certainty and process over pronouncement is essential. This includes encouraging students to actively seek out diverse perspectives, to engage in respectful debate, and to understand that intellectual growth often stems from the recognition and correction of error. The goal should be to produce citizens who are not merely informed, but intellectually honest and capable of independent, rigorous thought. Secondly, we must actively champion and protect genuine expertise. This does not imply an uncritical deference to authority, but rather a discerning appreciation for the arduous journey of mastery. We must cultivate a societal respect for knowledge that is earned through diligent study, rigorous peer review, and continuous self-correction. Media organizations in particular bear a heavy responsibility to prioritize informed analysis over sensationalism, to fact-check diligently, and to provide platforms for genuine experts rather than merely the most vocal. By distinguishing between informed opinion and confident conjecture, and by highlighting the processes through which true knowledge is established, we can begin to rebuild trust in verifiable facts and reasoned discourse. Thirdly, we must foster cultures, both within institutions and in wider society, that actively reward intellectual humility and the admission of ignorance. Leaders, educators, and public figures have a crucial role to play in modeling these behaviors. When leaders openly acknowledge their limitations, seek diverse counsel, and demonstrate a willingness to learn and adapt, they set a powerful precedent. Such an environment encourages others to admit when they do not know, to ask questions, and to engage in collaborative problem-solving rather than defensive posturing. This cultural shift requires a re-evaluation of what we define as strength, moving away from an association with unwavering certainty towards an appreciation for adaptive intelligence and reflective wisdom. Finally, the spiritual insights we explored in Chapter 3 remain profoundly relevant for the collective. The ancient wisdom traditions universally cautioned against the dangers of ego-driven delusion, whether individual or collective. They understood that true wisdom emerges from a deep awareness of one's own limitations, a humility before the vastness of existence, and a commitment to truth that transcends personal or tribal allegiances. Cultivating mindfulness, compassion, and a sense of interconnectedness can help to dismantle the rigid intellectual boundaries that fuel collective Dunning-Kruger. By fostering an inner landscape of self-awareness and ethical responsibility, we lay the groundwork for a more discerning and less deluded public square. The challenge of the Dunning-Kruger effect, therefore, extends far beyond the individual's mind. It is a profound societal challenge, deeply embedded in our cognitive architecture, amplified by our technologies, and exacerbated by our tribal tendencies. Overcoming it demands not just individual effort, but a collective commitment to intellectual honesty, critical thought, and genuine humility. It requires us to collectively confront the uncomfortable truth that our most dangerous delusions are often those we hold with the greatest conviction. The pursuit of wisdom, both personal and collective, remains an ongoing, arduous, yet ultimately indispensable endeavor for the flourishing of human civilization. The journey towards a more enlightened society is, in essence, a continuous process of shedding the illusions of certainty and embracing the liberating power of genuine inquiry. We have journeyed through the intricate landscapes of the human mind, from the individual cognitive bias that blinds us to our own incompetence to the societal reverberations that amplify collective delusion. Our exploration of the Dunning-Kruger effect, Doki, has revealed it not merely as a modern psychological quirk, but as a profound, perennial challenge to human flourishing. a scientific articulation of ancient spiritual insights into the nature of ignorance and ego. As we stand at the precipice of this understanding, the question shifts from what DK is to how we might fundamentally reorient ourselves, individually and collectively, towards a more enlightened future. The preceding chapters have meticulously laid bare the mechanics of DKE, the dual burden of incompetence coupled with the inability to recognize it, rooted in a metacognitive deficit. We observed how this bias, far from being a mere intellectual failing, mirrors the spiritual concepts of avidya, salsa, and ahamkara. Fundamental ignorance and the egoic self-delusion that obscure the path to truth. We traced its insidious amplification in the digital age, where the illusion of knowledge is readily manufactured and certainty is often prized over genuine insight, and we posited antidotes, both personal, humility, rigorous self-awareness, metacognitive training, and systemic reimagining education, championing expertise, fostering cultures of intellectual honesty. Now, in this concluding chapter, we seek to synthesize these threads, not merely to summarize, but to articulate a more profound vision of what it means to be truly wise in an era increasingly susceptible to the allure of facile certainty. The task before us is not to eradicate DKE, for it is woven into the very fabric of human cognition, a shadow accompanying the light of consciousness. Rather, it is to cultivate a perpetual vigilance against its encroachments, transforming it from an unwitting impediment into a conscious catalyst for growth. The Dunning-Kruger effect in its essence represents a failure of self-knowledge. It is a symptom of the human mind's remarkable capacity for self-deception, a protective mechanism perhaps, designed to maintain a fragile sense of self-worth, yet ultimately corrosive to genuine progress. When we fail to recognize our limitations, we cease to learn, to grow, to adapt. We become closed systems, impervious to feedback, trapped within the echo chamber of our own uninformed convictions. This stasis, whether in an individual's personal development or a society's collective evolution, is the antithesis of wisdom. Ancient traditions, long before the advent of psychological laboratories, understood this dynamic with startling clarity. The Socratic paradox, "I know that I know nothing," is not a statement of intellectual nihilism, but an affirmation of profound humility. The recognition that true wisdom begins with an acknowledgement of one's own ignorance. This insight, echoed across diverse spiritual paths, posits that the journey towards enlightenment is fundamentally a process of shedding illusions, of dismantling the edifice of the ego that constructs a false sense of knowing. The DKE, therefore, is but a contemporary empirical validation of this timeless spiritual truth, that self-deception is the primary obstacle to self-realization. Our modern world, with its unprecedented access to information, presents a peculiar paradox. While the tools for knowledge acquisition are ubiquitous, the capacity for genuine understanding and critical discernment appears to be waning. The digital realm, which promises to democratize knowledge, too often democratizes ignorance, allowing superficial familiarity to masquerade as expertise. Here, the DKE finds fertile ground, empowering individuals to articulate strong opinions on complex subjects with minimal understanding, their confidence inflated by the immediate validation of like-minded peers within curated algorithmic spaces. This phenomenon is not merely an inconvenience, it is a direct threat to the foundations of informed discourse, reasoned debate, and collective problem-solving. Consider the profound implications for leadership, governance, and societal progress. When individuals afflicted by DKE rise to positions of influence, their overconfidence can lead to disastrous decisions. Their inability to recognize their limitations, preventing them from seeking genuine expertise or adapting to unforeseen challenges. We witness the erosion of trust in institutions and experts, replaced by a populist skepticism that often mistakes intellectual humility for weakness and bombastic certainty for strength. The collective DKE, amplified by tribalism and misinformation, fragments societies, making it increasingly difficult to forge consensus on critical issues, from climate change to public health. The antidote, then, must be equally profound and multifaceted. It requires a radical reorientation of our values, both personal and societal. Individually, we must cultivate a relentless commitment to metacognition, the ability to think about our own thinking, to scrutinize the origins and validity of our beliefs, to actively seek disconfirming evidence. This is not a passive exercise, but an active, often uncomfortable discipline of self-inquiry. It demands intellectual courage to confront our own biases, to admit when we are wrong, and to embrace the discomfort of not knowing. This journey, as painful as it may sometimes be, is the crucible in which genuine self-awareness is forged. Beyond individual practice, we must advocate for systemic changes that foster intellectual humility and critical thought from the earliest stages of education. Our pedagogical models must shift from mere information transfer to the cultivation of discernment, curiosity, and the capacity for lifelong learning. We must teach not just what to think, but how to evaluate sources, how to construct logical arguments, how to engage respectfully with dissenting viewpoints. Education, in this sense, becomes not just a preparation for a career, but a preparation for responsible citizenship in a complex world, equipping individuals with the tools to navigate the treacherous waters of misinformation and self-deception. Furthermore, we must champion cultures that reward intellectual humility rather than penalize it. In our workplaces, our communities, and our public discourse, we must create spaces where vulnerability and admitting ignorance is seen as a strength, where asking clarifying questions is celebrated, and where the pursuit of mastery is prioritized over the performance of certainty. This necessitates a collective commitment to valuing expertise, not blindly but critically, recognizing that true experts are often those most aware of the boundaries of their knowledge. The spiritual traditions offer a powerful framework for this reorientation. They remind us that the ego's insatiable desire for certainty and superiority is a primary source of suffering and delusion. The path to wisdom, therefore, involves a continuous process of ego transcendence, of loosening the grip of the self on its cherished beliefs, and of opening oneself to the vastness of the unknown. Practices such as mindfulness, meditation, and contemplative inquiry, which foster a non-judgmental awareness of one's own thoughts and emotions, can be invaluable tools in this endeavor. They help us to observe the ego's machinations without identifying with them, creating the necessary distance to question our own assumptions and biases. Ultimately, overcoming the Dunning-Kruger effect is not about making everyone smart in the conventional sense. It is about cultivating a pervasive wisdom, a deep understanding of the limits of our knowledge, an unwavering commitment to truth, and an empathetic recognition of our shared human fallibility. It is about fostering a society where genuine inquiry is revered, where intellectual honesty is paramount, and where the pursuit of understanding is a collective endeavor rather than a competitive performance. This is not a destination we reach, but a perpetual process, a continuous shedding of illusions of certainty for the arduous, yet infinitely rewarding journey of genuine inquiry. Every time we pause to question our assumptions, every time we seek out perspectives that challenge our own, every time we admit I don't know, we chip away at the edifice of DKE. We contribute to a culture of humility, a collective consciousness more attuned to reality, more capable of navigating complexity, and more resilient in the face of uncertainty. The future of human flourishing, we contend, hinges upon this conscious, collective commitment to intellectual honesty and the profound, liberating wisdom that blossoms from recognizing the limits of our own understanding. The journey towards true enlightenment begins, and indeed continues, with the courage to confront the mirror of our own ignorance. The amplification of the Dunning-Kruger effect by the digital age presents not merely an intellectual puzzle, but a profound societal challenge, eroding the very foundations of trust and informed discourse. Yet, we are not consigned to a future defined by facile certainty and performative ignorance. The path forward, as both modern psychology and ancient wisdom suggest, lies in a concerted, multifaceted approach, demanding both individual introspection and systemic reform. It is a journey from the deceptive comfort of unearned confidence to the liberating clarity of pervasive wisdom, a journey we now endeavour to delineate with greater precision. Our exploration begins with the individual, for it is within the crucible of personal consciousness that the seeds of self-deception are sown and, conversely, where the first sprouts of awareness must emerge. The most potent individual antidote to the Dunning-Kruger effect is, without question, the cultivation of humility. This is not the false modesty that feigns ignorance while secretly harbouring pride, but rather a profound intellectual humility born from the recognition of the vast and boundless ocean of knowledge against the infinitesimal drop of one's own understanding. It is the Socratic wisdom of knowing what one does not know, a radical acceptance of cognitive limitations that paradoxically opens the mind to genuine learning. When we embrace humility, we dismantle the ego's defensive architecture, rendering us less susceptible to the illusory superiority that blinds the unskilled to their deficiencies. This intellectual posture invites curiosity, encourages diligent inquiry, and fosters a receptiveness to feedback, qualities antithetical to the DKE's entrenched certainty. Hand in hand with humility must come rigorous self-awareness, or what psychologists term metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking. This is the inner gaze, the capacity to monitor and evaluate our cognitive processes, to scrutinize the sources of our knowledge, and to critically assess the reliability of our conclusions. It necessitates an honest appraisal of our limitations, a courageous confrontation with our biases, and a willingness to acknowledge when our understanding is incomplete or flawed. This is not a passive contemplation, but an active, disciplined practice. It involves seeking out disconfirming evidence rather than merely accumulating information that reinforces pre-existing beliefs. It demands the establishment of robust feedback loops, actively soliciting critique from knowledgeable peers or mentors, and internalizing these insights for genuine growth. Furthermore, deliberate practice, the intentional, focused effort to improve a specific skill, often guided by expert instruction and immediate feedback, is a powerful countermeasure. By systematically engaging with a domain, individuals inevitably encounter the complexities and nuances that initially eluded them, revealing the depth of their prior ignorance and recalibrating their self-assessment. This process, by its very nature, pushes individuals past the initial peak of illusory confidence through the valley of despair towards a more accurate and ultimately higher level of competence. Ancient spiritual traditions, long before the advent of modern psychology, understood the critical role of such self-awareness in transcending the ego's delusions. Practices like mindfulness and meditation, found across Buddhist, Vedantic and contemplative Christian traditions, are precisely designed to cultivate this inner observational capacity. By training the mind to observe its own processes, thoughts, emotions, biases, without immediate identification or judgment, these practices weaken the ego's grip and dissolve the illusion of a fixed, omniscient self. They foster a detachment from the narratives we construct about our own competence, allowing for a more objective assessment of reality. When the incessant chatter of the ego subsides, a deeper, more authentic understanding can emerge, one rooted in direct experience rather than inflated self-perception. This spiritual dimension underscores that overcoming the Dunning-Kruger effect is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a profound journey of self-transformation, a shedding of the avidya, ignorance, and ahamkara, ego sense, that obscure our true nature and limit our perception of truth. Yet individual effort, however diligent, operates within a larger ecosystem. Thus, systemic antidotes are equally indispensable in fostering a society less susceptible to the Dunning-Kruger effect. Foremost among these is a fundamental reimagining of education. Our current educational paradigms often prioritize rote memorization and the accumulation of facts, inadvertently rewarding superficial understanding. A reformed education system must instead champion critical thinking, intellectual humility, and the art of questioning assumptions. It must teach students how to think, not merely what to think. This involves fostering a deep curiosity, encouraging students to grapple with ambiguity, and providing tools for discerning reliable information from misinformation. We must cultivate an appreciation for the process of inquiry, for the iterative nature of knowledge acquisition, and for the wisdom inherent in admitting, "I don't know." This approach would equip individuals with the metacognitive tools necessary to navigate complex information landscapes and to accurately gauge their own understanding. Furthermore, society must consciously endeavour to champion genuine expertise and re-establish trust in intellectual authority. In an era where every opinion seems to carry equal weight, and where armchair experts proliferate online, discerning true competence from confident bluster becomes increasingly challenging. This requires a renewed societal commitment to rigorous peer review, to evidence-based reasoning, and to the painstaking process of acquiring deep knowledge and specialized skills. Institutions, universities, scientific bodies, reputable media organizations bear a significant responsibility in upholding standards of intellectual integrity and in clearly articulating the value of sustained inquiry and verified expertise. We must create spaces and platforms that privilege reasoned argument, nuanced discussion, and the provisional nature of scientific understanding over the sensationalism of absolute certainty. This involves actively countering the narratives that denigrate experts, and instead celebrating those who dedicate themselves to the arduous pursuit of truth. Finally, we must strive to foster cultures that reward intellectual honesty and the admission of ignorance. Too often, admitting uncertainty or acknowledging a lack of knowledge is perceived as a weakness, especially in professional or public spheres. This societal pressure incentivizes individuals to project an image of competence even when it is unwarranted, thereby reinforcing the Dunning-Kruger dynamic. To counteract this, we must cultivate environments, in our workplaces, our educational institutions, and our public discourse, where asking questions is celebrated, where intellectual vulnerability is seen as a strength, and where learning is understood as a continuous lifelong process. This means encouraging collaborative learning, valuing diverse perspectives, and actively seeking out disconfirming viewpoints as opportunities for growth rather than threats to one's ego. When the fear of being wrong is diminished, the incentive to feign knowledge dissipates, and the path opens for genuine intellectual exchange and collective advancement. These individual and systemic antidotes converge upon a singular overarching goal: to move beyond facile certainty towards pervasive wisdom. This wisdom is not merely the accumulation of facts or the demonstration of high IQ. Rather, it is a profound understanding of the limits of knowledge, a deep appreciation for complexity, a commitment to truth that transcends ego, and an empathetic recognition of human fallibility, both our own and that of others. It is the ability to navigate uncertainty with grace, to engage in dialogue with humility, and to make decisions informed by a comprehensive rather than superficial understanding. The journey towards this pervasive wisdom is, by its very nature, a continuous and collective endeavour. It demands constant vigilance against the allure of easy answers and the seductive comfort of unexamined beliefs. It requires a societal commitment to intellectual rigour, ethical reflection, and the cultivation of inner peace, by shedding the illusions of certainty that the Dunning-Kruger effect so powerfully embodies. We do more than merely correct a cognitive bias. We embark upon a path that promises not only individual flourishing, but also the advancement of human civilization towards a more enlightened, compassionate and truth-seeking future. The stakes are nothing less than the quality of our collective understanding and the very fabric of our shared reality. The aspiration towards pervasive wisdom, as we have elucidated, is not merely an individual endeavour, but a collective crucible in which the very fabric of society is forged and refined. It demands a fundamental reorientation, a profound cultural shift away from the superficial certainty that characterises the Dunning-Kruger effect towards a deeper, more nuanced appreciation of knowledge, ignorance, and the intricate dance between them. This shift, we contend, is not a passive evolution, but an active, deliberate construction, requiring systemic interventions as much as personal introspection. We have identified the necessity of reimagining education, championing genuine expertise, and fostering cultures of intellectual honesty. Now we must delve into the practical architecture of these transformations, exploring the pathways through which a society might cultivate the metacognitive capacities and humble disposition essential for truly overcoming the allure of unfounded confidence. This is not a utopian vision, but a pragmatic roadmap for navigating the complexities of human cognition and interaction in an increasingly interconnected world. Reimagining education, cultivating the seeds of humility and inquiry. The traditional paradigms of education, often rooted in rote memorization and the dissemination of established facts, inadvertently contribute to the fertile ground upon which the Dunning-Kruger effect thrives. By prioritizing the what over the how and why, they can instill a false sense of comprehensive understanding, leading individuals to believe that the accumulation of data equates to true wisdom. To counteract this, our educational systems must undergo a radical metamorphosis, shifting their focus from mere knowledge transfer to the cultivation of critical thinking, metacognition, and, crucially, intellectual humility. A reimagined education, therefore, begins not with answers but with questions. It actively encourages students to grapple with ambiguity, to embrace the discomfort of not knowing, and to understand that the pursuit of knowledge is an unending journey, not a finite destination. Pedagogical approaches must move beyond the passive reception of information to active engagement, problem-based learning, and the Socratic inquiry. We must teach students not just what to think, but how to analyze, synthesize, evaluate, and perhaps most importantly, how to recognize the limits of their own understanding. This involves instilling a robust sense of metacognition from an early age. Children can be guided to reflect on their own thought processes, to assess the reliability of their sources, and to articulate the steps they took to arrive at a conclusion. They must learn to distinguish between opinion and evidence, between intuition and reasoned argument. This is not about eroding confidence, but about grounding it in a realistic appraisal of one's abilities and the scope of one's knowledge. We envision curricula that explicitly teach cognitive biases, including the Dunning-Kruger effect itself, empowering individuals with the language and conceptual frameworks to identify these traps in themselves and others. Furthermore, a truly transformative education champions intellectual humility as a core virtue. It celebrates the admission of ignorance as a gateway to deeper learning rather than as a mark of failure. It encourages students to seek out diverse perspectives, to engage in respectful debate, and to genuinely consider disconfirming evidence. This means fostering environments where curiosity is paramount, where intellectual risk-taking is encouraged, and where the process of inquiry is valued as much as, if not more than, the final answer. The goal is to cultivate minds that are not only capable of acquiring knowledge, but are also acutely aware of the vastness of what remains unknown, preparing them not just for careers, but for a lifetime of thoughtful engagement with the world. In an era saturated with information and characterized by the ubiquitous presence of armchair experts, the erosion of trust in genuine expertise poses a significant threat to rational discourse and societal progress. The Dunning-Kruger effect, amplified by digital echo chambers, has blurred the lines between informed opinion and unfounded assertion. To counteract this, society must commit to actively championing genuine expertise, understanding that true mastery is earned through rigorous study, extensive experience, and a profound awareness of the field's complexities and limitations. This requires a multi-pronged approach. Firstly, institutions of higher learning, scientific bodies, and professional organizations bear the responsibility of upholding the highest standards of scholarship and ethical conduct. They must serve as beacons of intellectual rigor, clearly delineating the methodologies, peer review processes, and evidential standards that differentiate genuine expertise from mere opinion. Their role is not just to produce experts, but to communicate the value and reliability of that expertise to the broader public. Secondly, media literacy becomes an indispensable skill. Citizens must be equipped to critically evaluate sources, to discern credible information from misinformation, and to understand the biases inherent in various forms of communication. This involves teaching individuals to look beyond sensational headlines, to scrutinize the credentials of those making claims, and to recognize the telltale signs of intellectual dishonesty or overconfidence. The media itself has a crucial role to play in this, moving beyond the false equivalence of both sides to responsibly highlight established facts and vetted expert consensus. Crucially, genuine experts themselves must embrace a renewed sense of responsibility. While their knowledge is deep, their communication must be clear, accessible, and humble. They must be willing to acknowledge the uncertainties and limitations within their fields, resisting the temptation to oversimplify complex issues for public consumption. An expert who can articulate what is known, what is unknown, and what is merely hypothesized demonstrates a level of metacognitive awareness that is itself a powerful antidote to the Dunning-Kruger effect. By modeling intellectual humility and engaging in transparent discourse, experts can rebuild the trust that is essential for a society to make informed decisions and progress effectively. We must foster an environment where the voice of the truly knowledgeable is not drowned out by the clamour of the confidently ignorant, but rather elevated and respected for its depth and nuance. Beyond educational reforms and the re-elevation of expertise, the most profound societal transformation required to mitigate the Dunning-Kruger effect lies in cultivating cultures that intrinsically value intellectual honesty. This demands a fundamental shift in our social incentives, moving away from rewarding confident pronouncements and superficial certainty towards celebrating thoughtful inquiry, the admission of ignorance, and the courageous pursuit of truth, however uncomfortable it may be. Such a culture begins with the re-evaluation of our communication norms. We must learn to distinguish between conviction born of deep understanding and conviction fueled by cognitive bias. Public discourse, instead of devolving into shouting matches between entrenched positions, should aspire to be a collaborative search for understanding. This requires developing skills in active listening, empathetic engagement, and the art of constructive disagreement. When individuals feel safe to admit they don't know, or to change their minds in the face of new evidence, the collective intelligence of a group is dramatically enhanced. Leadership across all sectors, political, corporate, academic, and community, plays a pivotal role in modelling and reinforcing these values. Leaders who demonstrate intellectual humility, who actively solicit diverse perspectives, who admit their own uncertainties, and who are open to being challenged, set a powerful precedent. They create environments where curiosity is encouraged, where feedback is genuinely sought and acted upon, and where the pursuit of truth takes precedence over the maintenance of ego or power. Conversely, leaders who project an unwavering, unearned certainty inadvertently validate the Dunning-Kruger effect, creating a ripple effect of overconfidence and intellectual stagnation within their organizations. Furthermore, a culture of intellectual honesty embraces the process of inquiry as inherently valuable. It recognizes that true progress often emerges from iterative cycles of questioning, hypothesizing, testing, and revising. It understands that failure in the scientific or intellectual sense is not an endpoint, but a crucial data point that refines understanding. This means shifting societal rewards from simply achieving success, often defined by immediate outcomes or public acclaim, to valuing the rigor of the investigative journey, the integrity of the method, and the courage to confront one's own biases. Such a culture would naturally integrate robust feedback loops into every aspect of life, from personal relationships to professional endeavors. Constructive criticism, delivered and received with respect, becomes a vital tool for self-correction and growth. The absence of such feedback, or its dismissal due to overconfidence, is a hallmark of the Dunning-Kruger effect. By actively seeking out and internalizing feedback, individuals and groups can continuously calibrate their understanding and refine their competence, fostering a dynamic environment of continuous learning and improvement. The journey towards pervasive wisdom is undeniably arduous, a continuous struggle against deeply ingrained human tendencies and the siren song of simplistic certainty. The Dunning-Kruger effect, in its modern manifestation, reminds us that the ancient spiritual injunctions against avidya and ahamkara are not abstract philosophical tenets but urgent psychological realities. Overcoming this cognitive bias is not a one-time fix, but a sustained commitment, demanding constant vigilance against self-deception and an unwavering embrace of genuine inquiry. Individually, we must cultivate the metacognitive muscle, practice radical self-awareness, and actively seek out perspectives that challenge our preconceived notions. Collectively, we must build the societal infrastructure through education, media, and leadership that nurtures intellectual humility, rewards honest inquiry, and champions genuine expertise. This is not merely an academic exercise, it is an existential imperative. For in a world of increasing complexity and interconnectedness, the costs of widespread overconfidence and unacknowledged ignorance are profound. They manifest in flawed policies, polarized societies, and a collective inability to address pressing global challenges. Conversely, a society that truly values humility, critical thinking, and a realistic appraisal of its own knowledge stands poised for unprecedented flourishing. It is a society capable of learning, adapting, innovating, and ultimately navigating the human condition with greater wisdom and compassion. The path forward is clear, though steep. It is the path of relentless self-examination, open dialogue, and a profound collective commitment to the ongoing pursuit of truth. The challenge, we contend, is not merely to identify the Dunning-Kruger effect as a pervasive cognitive bias, nor solely to lament its amplification within the digital maelstrom. The true exigency lies in actively constructing a society that consistently embraces inquiry, humility, and self-examination over the seductive comfort of unexamined beliefs. This is a monumental undertaking, for it requires nothing less than a fundamental reorientation of human nature, a conscious effort to transcend the very mechanisms of ego and self-deception that have shaped our perception of reality for millennia. To embark upon this construction, we must first confront the profound resistance inherent in the human psyche to such a transformation. The Dunning-Kruger effect, as we have explored, is not a malicious deception, but an unwitting one, born of a genuine lack of metacognitive capacity. Yet, this lack is frequently buttressed by a deeply ingrained aversion to admitting ignorance or error, an aversion rooted in ego. The act of questioning one's own competence, of acknowledging the vastness of one's blind spots, can be existentially unsettling. It threatens our self-image, our social standing, and our fundamental need for certainty in an uncertain world. This psychological inertia, fortified by the reinforcing biases we have detailed, makes the cultivation of intellectual humility an arduous, often uncomfortable discipline. Consider for a moment the societal structures that have historically rewarded certainty, even if unfounded. From ancient oracles to modern political rhetoric, the confident pronouncement has often carried more weight than the nuanced deliberation. In our contemporary milieu, the digital sphere exacerbates this, favouring the declarative and the absolute over the tentative and the reflective. This creates a feedback loop. Individuals are rewarded for projecting confidence regardless of expertise, and this external validation further solidifies their internal, often illusory sense of competence. To reverse this trend requires a collective re-evaluation of what we truly value: superficial assurance or genuine understanding. The architecture of pervasive wisdom, therefore, must be built upon a foundation that understands and mitigates this inherent resistance. At the individual level, it demands a continuous, rigorous practice of self-awareness. This goes beyond the mere intellectual acknowledgement of DKE. It entails cultivating a visceral understanding of one's own limitations, a readiness to be proven wrong, and an active seeking of perspectives that challenge one's established beliefs. This is the essence of metacognitive mastery, not just thinking about thinking, but actively interrogating one's thinking, tracing the origins of one's convictions, and identifying potential biases. It means adopting a stance of perpetual student, recognizing that true expertise is characterized not by knowing everything, but by knowing how much one does not know, and possessing the tools to learn more. This individual discipline, however, is insufficient without corresponding shifts at the collective level. A society truly committed to pervasive wisdom must foster environments where intellectual humility is not merely tolerated but celebrated. This necessitates the creation of what we might term epistemic safe spaces, arenas, both physical and virtual, where individuals feel secure enough to admit ignorance, voice doubt, and propose tentative hypotheses without fear of ridicule or professional repercussions. It requires valuing the process of inquiry above the immediate gratification of a definitive answer. Robust feedback loops, previously identified as an antidote, must be systematically embedded into our social and professional interactions, designed not to shame, but to enlighten and refine understanding. This means actively soliciting constructive criticism, engaging in peer review that is genuinely critical, and establishing mentorship relationships that prioritize intellectual growth over ego preservation. The transformation must extend to our foundational institutions, particularly education. Our current educational paradigms often prioritize the accumulation of facts and the demonstration of correct answers. While knowledge acquisition is vital, it must be balanced, if not superseded, by the cultivation of critical thinking, epistemic humility, and the skills of discernment. Education, in this reimagined form, would not merely teach what to think, but fundamentally how to think, how to evaluate evidence, how to identify logical fallacies, how to recognize and mitigate one's own biases, and critically, how to admit when one does not know. It would foster a love for inquiry and a comfort with ambiguity, preparing individuals not just for careers, but for a lifetime of adaptive learning and intellectual humility. Imagine curricula designed to explicitly teach metacognition, to engage students in exercises of deliberate practice in self-assessment, and to reward the thoughtful articulation of doubt as much as the confident presentation of fact. Beyond formal education, the media and information ecosystem bear a profound responsibility. If the digital age has amplified DKE by rewarding simplistic certainty, then a societal shift demands a media landscape that champions nuance, complexity, and intellectual honesty. This means media outlets prioritizing depth over sensationalism, context over brevity, and diverse perspectives over echo chambers. It requires fostering media literacy among the populace, equipping individuals with the tools to critically evaluate sources, recognize misinformation, and resist the allure of performative certainty. It calls for a collective commitment to supporting journalism that investigates, interrogates, and illuminates, rather than merely confirms existing biases. Furthermore, leadership across all sectors, political, corporate, scientific, and cultural, must model intellectual humility. Leaders who admit mistakes, actively seek disconfirming evidence, and surround themselves with diverse thinkers rather than sycophants, set a powerful precedent. Their willingness to say, "Don't know, let's find out," or "My initial assessment was incorrect and here's what we've learned," can dismantle the societal premium placed on infallible certainty. Such leadership fosters an organizational culture where learning from failure is seen as growth, and where the collective intelligence of a group is harnessed through open dialogue and rigorous debate, rather than stifled by the ego of a single individual. This journey towards pervasive wisdom, however, is not a destination to be reached, but an unending process of aspiration and refinement. The Dunning-Kruger effect, in its essence, reflects a fundamental human vulnerability, the gap between our self-perception and reality. While we may develop sophisticated tools and methodologies to mitigate its effects, the potential for self-deception and overconfidence will always remain a latent tendency within the human spirit. Thus, the cultivation of wisdom is a continuous practice, a constant vigilance against the subtle creep of ego and the seductive siren song of unexamined belief. It is a commitment to lifelong learning, not just in terms of acquiring new information, but in continually refining our capacity for self-reflection and critical assessment. Ultimately, the insights gleaned from modern psychology regarding the Dunning-Kruger effect resonate with the timeless wisdom of ancient spiritual traditions. Both illuminate the profound obstacles posed by ignorance and ego to the attainment of truth and genuine understanding. The modern articulation provides a scientific lens through which to understand these ancient truths, offering empirical validation for the necessity of humility, self-awareness, and constant inquiry. Our collective future, we contend, hinges upon our capacity to heed these insights. In an increasingly complex, interconnected, and rapidly changing world, the luxury of unexamined beliefs and misplaced confidence is one we can ill afford. From navigating global crises to fostering local communities, the ability to accurately assess our knowledge, admit our limitations, and engage in open, humble inquiry is paramount. Pervasive wisdom is not merely an intellectual ideal, it is an existential imperative. It is the bedrock upon which we can build societies that are resilient, adaptive, and truly intelligent. Societies that prioritize understanding over certainty, collaboration over polarization, and the arduous, yet ultimately rewarding pursuit of truth over the comfortable illusion of knowing. This is the profound work that awaits us, a continuous collective endeavor to bridge the gap between our perceived competence and our actual capacity, thereby unlocking the full potential of human flourishing. Having traversed the labyrinthine corridors of individual self-deception and the contemporary amplifications of the Dunning-Kruger effect, we now stand at a crucial juncture, the active construction of antidotes. We have posited that the path to genuine understanding necessitates a dual assault on ignorance, addressing both the internal cognitive biases that cloud individual judgment and the external systemic forces that perpetuate collective delusion. While the cultivation of intellectual humility, rigorous self-awareness, and metacognitive capacity offers a formidable defense at the personal level, a vital and unending endeavor, it is insufficient in isolation. The very fabric of our societies, the institutions that shape our learning and discourse, must also be reimagined and reformed. It is to these systemic antidotes and the profound vision of pervasive wisdom they promise that we now turn our focus. The first and arguably most foundational systemic antidote lies in a radical reimagining of our educational paradigms. For too long, education has often prioritized the assimilation of facts and the demonstration of rote knowledge, inadvertently fostering an environment where superficial understanding can masquerade as genuine competence. The Dunning-Kruger effect thrives in such conditions, where the mere recollection of information is mistaken for its deep comprehension or critical application. To counteract this, we must shift our pedagogical focus from what to know to how to know, and crucially, how to know that we do not know. This necessitates a curriculum that actively cultivates critical thinking, not as an abstract skill, but as an ingrained habit of mind. It means teaching students not just to consume information, but to dissect it, to question its provenance, to evaluate its underlying assumptions, and to recognize the inherent biases of both its purveyors and themselves. How then do we design an educational system that inoculates against the Dunning-Kruger effect? We propose a framework rooted in metacognition and intellectual humility from the earliest stages of learning. This entails pedagogical approaches that explicitly teach students to reflect on their own thought processes, to identify their knowledge gaps, to articulate the limits of their understanding, and to actively seek disconfirming evidence rather than merely reinforcing existing beliefs. Imagine classrooms where the admission of "I don't know, but I'm willing to learn" is celebrated as a sign of intellectual maturity rather than a deficiency. Envision assignments that reward not just correct answers, but the rigorous articulation of the process of arriving at those answers, including the acknowledgement of uncertainties and alternative perspectives. Project-based learning, Socratic seminars, and collaborative problem-solving, when designed with these metacognitive objectives in mind, can foster environments where students learn the value of iterative inquiry, the necessity of peer feedback, and the profound discomfort and ultimate liberation of confronting one's own misconceptions. Such an education would not merely transmit knowledge, it would cultivate wisdom, equipping individuals with the internal compass to navigate the complexities of information and the humility to acknowledge the vastness of the unknown. Beyond the classroom, a robust societal antidote requires the deliberate rechampioning of genuine expertise. In an era where every opinion can be amplified to the same volume, and where the internet often democratizes noise as much as it does knowledge, the distinction between informed insight and confident ignorance has become perilously blurred. The Dunning-Kruger effect, amplified by digital platforms, allows individuals with minimal understanding to dismiss the insights of seasoned professionals, from climate scientists to epidemiologists, with an unearned air of authority. To counter this, we must collectively reaffirm the value of sustained inquiry, rigorous methodology, and the arduous process of accumulating deep knowledge. This does not imply an uncritical deference to authority, but rather a discerning appreciation for those who have dedicated themselves to mastering complex domains, who understand the nuances, the caveats, and the ongoing debates within their fields. This rechampioning of expertise involves several key components. Firstly, institutions, academic, scientific, and journalistic, must uphold and communicate rigorous standards of evidence, peer review, and ethical conduct. They must actively resist the temptation to sensationalize or simplify complex issues to the point of distortion, and instead commit to conveying the nuanced realities of scientific consensus and ongoing research. Secondly, media literacy must become a universal skill, empowering citizens to critically evaluate sources, identify logical fallacies, and distinguish between credible reporting and partisan rhetoric or outright disinformation. This means teaching individuals how to trace information to its original source, how to recognize the hallmarks of sound methodology, and how to identify the financial or ideological motivations that might underpin certain narratives. Finally, and perhaps most challenging, we must cultivate a societal culture that values the process of expertise, the years of study, the painstaking research, the humility in the face of uncertainty, over the superficial appeal of instant answers and charismatic certainty. This requires a collective shift away from the glorification of gut feelings and towards a respect for evidence-based reasoning, even when such reasoning is complex or inconvenient. The most ambitious systemic antidote, however, lies in cultivating cultures across society that actively reward intellectual honesty, open inquiry, and the courageous admission of ignorance. This is a profound shift from our current tendencies, where performative certainty often garners more social capital than nuanced reflection. In many professional, political, and even social contexts, admitting "I don't know" or "I was wrong" is perceived as a weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited, rather than a strength indicative of intellectual integrity and a willingness to learn. This social conditioning directly reinforces the Dunning-Kruger trap, as individuals are incentivized to project unearned confidence rather than risk the perceived humiliation of admitting fallibility. To reverse this, we must consciously construct environments where humility is not just tolerated, but celebrated. Imagine workplaces where leaders model intellectual humility, actively soliciting dissenting opinions and acknowledging their own blind spots. Envision political discourse where candidates are applauded for nuanced positions and for admitting the inherent complexities of societal challenges, rather than resorting to simplistic slogans and absolute pronouncements. Consider communities where open dialogue, characterized by active listening and a genuine desire to understand differing perspectives, replaces the combative certainty of echo chambers. This cultural transformation necessitates a shift in our collective values, moving away from an admiration for unwavering conviction, which can often be a symptom of DKE, towards a profound respect for intellectual agility, adaptability, and the relentless pursuit of truth, even when that truth challenges our most cherished beliefs. It means fostering empathy for those who struggle with complex ideas, recognizing that genuine understanding is a journey, not a static state. Yet, we are not naive to the inherent difficulties of these aspirations. The implementation of these antidotes is far from a straightforward task, for they confront deeply entrenched human tendencies and systemic inertia. The ego, that ancient adversary of self-awareness, resists the admission of ignorance with formidable tenacity. The comfort of certainty, however ill-founded, is often preferred over the unsettling ambiguity of genuine inquiry. The allure of simple answers in a complex world remains potent, providing a psychological refuge from the cognitive effort required for critical thought. Furthermore, the political and economic structures that benefit from the perpetuation of confident ignorance, whether through the manipulation of public opinion or the exploitation of cognitive biases for commercial gain, present formidable barriers to reform. The very individuals most susceptible to the Dunning-Kruger effect are, by definition, the least likely to recognize their need for these antidotes, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of confident error. Despite these formidable challenges, the vision of pervasive wisdom remains our guiding star. This is not an idealistic utopia where all ignorance is eradicated, but rather a resilient and adaptive societal state characterized by a collective commitment to intellectual honesty and continuous learning. Pervasive wisdom manifests not as the absence of error, but as the widespread capacity to recognize and correct error, both individually and collectively. It is a society where the default stance is one of open inquiry, where knowledge is understood as provisional and ever-evolving, and where the pursuit of understanding is valued above the assertion of unearned certainty. In such a society, the Dunning-Kruger effect would not disappear entirely, for it is rooted in fundamental human cognitive architecture, but its corrosive impact would be significantly mitigated. Its manifestations would be met not with unchallenged acceptance, but with gentle inquiry, metacognitive prompting, and a collective willingness to guide individuals toward greater self-awareness. This pervasive wisdom would permeate our daily interactions, fostering more constructive dialogues and more empathetic understandings of differing viewpoints. It would inform public discourse, elevating the quality of debate and enabling more effective solutions to complex societal problems. It would guide policy making, ensuring decisions are grounded in evidence, humility, and a clear understanding of potential unintended consequences. Ultimately, pervasive wisdom is the deep understanding of knowledge limits, a commitment to truth beyond ego, and an empathetic recognition of human fallibility woven into the very fabric of our collective consciousness. It is an unending, collective process, requiring continuous vigilance against self-deception and an unwavering embrace of genuine inquiry. The journey towards this pervasive wisdom is arduous, demanding both individual courage and collective will. It necessitates a constant vigilance against the seductive siren song of unearned confidence and a persistent cultivation of the humility that is the true hallmark of intelligence. In the chapters that follow, we will explore the practical implications of this ongoing endeavour, examining how we might navigate the inevitable resistances and sustain the momentum towards a more self-aware and genuinely intelligent future. For the challenge of the Dunning-Kruger effect is not merely a psychological curiosity, it is a profound call to cultivate a deeper, more resilient form of human understanding, one that embraces the limits of our knowledge as the very gateway to wisdom.